VikesNow, I am Dustin Baker. This is the February 21st episode. We are 19 days away from legal tampering and free agency when business really kicks off. We have Thor Nystrom back for us for the second time. We had him on last year. How you doing, homie?
I'm doing great. Good to see you guys.
Absolutely. And we're going to chat about some Viking stuff. We're here with Josh Fry, who is our mainstay Wednesday guest. How are you, my man?
I'm good. Ready to pick Thor's brain a little bit about the draft. So always an exciting time.
Yeah, he's the dude with the fantasy football secrets. So I think at the end of the show, Josh is going to try to peel some of those off.
Yeah.
We knew that.
All right. So I've asked this question to multiple guests. I think it's an underrated offseason talker because we are totally engulfed by Kirk mania and Danielle Hunter free agent mania. On the Vikings rushing situation, Thor, in back-to-back seasons, they've ranked 27th for DVOA. They claimed last offseason they were going to fix the son of a bitch, and then they didn't. They arguably regressed. So I want to know two things about the 2024 rushing attack from you, kind sir. What should they do to fix it, personnel or scheme? And your prediction, what do they do to address RB1, or do they just do nothing?
So let's get the context there first. Madison has to come back, correct? Because of the cap situation. So you have him back. You're going to have Ty Chandler back. I think what they need to do is draft a starter, potential insta starter in round 3 is what I would suggest. Maybe round 4. The bad thing about this running back class is it stinks at the top. The good thing for the Vikings, though, is you're not going to delineate one of your limited picks with your limited cap situation to a running back in the second round, certainly not the first. That in the sort of the quagmire where the Vikings would begin picking, I think that's where you start to see potential values at running back. It's just picking the right guy. One guy that I think would be a really good fit, who I believe is going to get picks in somewhere in that late 3rd round, early 4th round range. Marshawn Lloyd from USC is one dude that I would toss out that I think is a really good scheme fit. But that's what I would try to do. Obviously, you maybe have one spot to play with in that running back room, but you want that guy to be a guy who can get on the field immediately, to your point of turning it around.
Okay, and so that's your endorsement, is round 3 or 4 for a decent prospect that could morph into a starter. What do you think they will do? You think they will do that as well, or will they run it back?
I do think they'll take one, yes. Will it be in the 3rd? Will it be the 4th? Or will they try to kick that can down to, the 5th or so? I don't know if they can go later than that, though, unless you're going to delineate free agent money to running backs, which would be even dumber. It's just a waste of a resource. That's where you want to do that is right around this range. So I think it just makes all the sense in the world, especially when you're looking for a guy who can come in and contribute immediately. And I think, you can take the skill set of Ty Chandler. You can take the skill set of Alexander Madison. I'm not sure exactly how much is there, but, between those two things, and then figure out a complementary guy that you think will best play alongside those guys, but hopefully as the 1A of that committee next year.
Do you think Dwayne McBride is a lost cause?
It didn't go so well this year. I was high on Dwayne McBride as a sleeper for later on, but he had holes in his game, to say the least. The biggest thing was lack of passing down utility. And then I just thought he was a really skilled runner, but he had the fumble problems at UAB. So you had some of these different things to work through. And you can't hang your hat on that kid being, a big part of that thing going forward. So yeah, I think you got to draft another one, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, and he also during the preseason just didn't satisfy the eye test, which I notoriously don't like, but I was like, yeah, this looks like a fullback. All right, Josh, what do you got for Thor on this lovely Wednesday?
Yeah, so obviously the big talker throughout the early portion of the offseason has been the quarterback position. Do the Vikings re-sign Kirk Cousins? So they go draft a guy in the first round. Given your choice of some of the top guys in this class, maybe outside of Caleb Williams, because I think he's going first overall, who do you think would be the best fit in the Vikings offense heading into 2024?
I think the best fit is J.J. McCarthy. I just think his game fits what O'Connell does so very well. A big part of it is the mobility, throwing on the run, out of the pocket, off platform, making decisions under duress. He was one of the best quarterbacks, if not the best quarterback in this class at those different things. KOC's offense, obviously you're sometimes moving the pocket. You're asking the quarterback to throw on the perimeter, different stuff like that. JJ McCarthy is also one of the best quarterbacks in this class, throwing over the middle. for instance, Michael Penix can't throw on the run at all, and he doesn't throw over the middle either for whatever reason. He likes to attack the sidelines and then down the field, whatever. JJ McCarthy is really, really good attacking the middle. Those layering concepts in KOC's offense, I think that's also a really good fit for it. The other guy like that I really like, and I think he's a good fit as well. I just think McCarthy, it's more clean in terms of that. I'm a big Jaden Daniels guy as well. If you can, the Patriots have already sort of put out there, we will listen to offers for the third pick. You're going to have to gauge, is it even theoretically possible? Can we meet that price? What would that price be to move to 3? That's the only spot where you're potentially going to get Jaden Daniels. Although I will say, I don't think certainly the betting public and probably the public in general is giving enough credence to the idea that Jaden Daniels will go number 2. For me, it is the opposite of a foregone conclusion that Drake May is the number 2 pick. I know that's been, for a year now, we've been indoctrinated into believing Caleb is guaranteed to go 1. Drake May is guaranteed to go number 2. I would push back at least on the Drake May thing for 2 different reasons. Number 2, I don't think he's worth the second pick. I think he's the 4th best quarterback in this class. Number 2, Cliff Kingsbury, the offensive coordinator of Washington. Look at his offense and look back at the guys he has been allowed to hand choose at quarterback the last 3 times he has made this decision. He kicked Davis Webb out of Texas Tech so that he could start Patrick Mahomes. Then it was Kyler Murray when he had the first pick at Arizona. And then last year, he turned down more lucrative coaching jobs so that he could coach Caleb Williams. What do these 3 guys have in common? It is all out of structure playmaking. That is, Drake May is like, you can argue what you want about Drake May. What you can argue is objectively, he is clearly the worst of the 4 in those categories. I just don't think he's a fit for Cliff's offense, even if you disagree with me about him being QB4. But let's say that Washington did do that, or they go a different direction, whatnot. Then, if Jaden Daniels is there at 3, that's where I would think about getting aggressive. But then you also have to gauge, where do we think Drake May is going to go? What would be the cost? Or I'm sorry, JJ McCarthy. Where do we think JJ McCarthy is going to go? What, it would be the price to potentially get that? Then you have to play the 3-dimensional chess thing.
Do you think it would be a matter of the Vikings needing to trade up to get JJ McCarthy, or do you think he'll be available there at number 11?
They're going to have to trade up.
Yeah,
they're going to have to trade up, and I think that it's a multiple different things. I think he was always a top 10 guy. This idea that he's been forwarded as a riser, I don't think is true within the NFL. I think they always viewed him as a top 10 guy. And then, the idea moving up, I think you got to get past the Falcons. I think if JJ McCarthy is on the board when the Falcons pick, it's going to be a very quick card turn in. The Atlanta Falcons, a team whose new offensive coordinator, Zach Robinson, a PFF guy. The PFF guys love the high leverage and the advanced analytics on the quarterbacks. Where JJ McCarthy suffers, it is the volume stats, the counting stats, where he shines, perhaps even as the number 1 quarterback in this entire class. It is the advanced stats. It's the high leverage situations, breaking it down 3rd, 4th down, red zone, under duress, not putting the ball up for grabs, different stuff like that. I think that's a quarterback that the Atlanta Falcons would be interested in for those reasons. But you also need to block those couple teams behind you, the Broncos, the Raiders, or Bronco. Who's the other one, right? Is it Raiders behind Broncos?
Raiders and then Saints, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, all those teams, exactly.
Yep.
So you got to block that little block. No, sorry, but right behind you, and then you have to get above the Falcons. I think that's where the JJ McCarthy discussion is.
Gotcha.
Will you be disappointed if the Vikings end up with Drake May?
No, I wouldn't say disappointed, because if the Vikings come out of the draft with any of the top 4 guys, I'm going to be stoked, because it means that the administration has finally made the decision. We're going to swallow the pill for a year, and we are going to attempt to build a roster that could maybe win the Super Bowl. The roster that we got now, it's not bad. It's fun to watch. It ain't going to win the Super Bowl. We know that now. They had plenty of chances for this, whatnot. The thing's got to get reconstituted. If Drake May is the 4th quarterback and he starts to fall down, and that's I'd be fine with that. I have him as QB4 on my whatever, but like I'm still going to have him as a top 5 guy in the class, because the way that you have to rank quarterbacks on your overall, it is such. Right. And if you're a team that needs a quarterback, you have to value it the same. So I wouldn't argue at all Drake May at 7 or 8. If he's the guy you have to trade up for, certainly if he fell to 11, absolutely, you turn that card in real quick.
So we talked about the Saints, the Broncos, or blocking in the block. Where does Justin Fields end up in this carousel?
I mean, that's a tough one, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
That's a really tough one. I'm gonna say the Falcons. I'll toss that one out because I don't know if that would be Robinson's prerogative, that move, but it might be the front offices. Because if let's play this out. The Bears, put it out there, Fields is available, whatnot. Are they going to get a second round offer? I sort of doubt it. And so will a third round pick, particularly if it's in the top 10 of the third round, will it trump all the other offers? I think so. And if you're the guy who's running the Falcons and making that decision, you could do the whole thing of, well, if we do 1 year of Fields for less than market value on the cap, we're trading a third round pick. Whether he succeeds or not here, we can just let him leave and recoup the end of the third round pick as a comp pick once he walks out the door. So there's literally no downside. Or if he succeeds, you get him out of Chicago. Now you put him around Bijan, Pitts, London, all the different guys that Arthur Smith wasted, and he succeeds. Now, potentially, we can use the option on him. We try to, roll it forward and maybe work out an extension for him after that without having had to delineate our top 10 pick to a quarterback. The Fields thing is so wide open, as you guys know. That one just makes a little bit of sense to me.
Yeah, I've thought that for quite some time. Atlanta would make a really decent fit, and he's kind of the curveball because I think we're getting toward the foregone conclusion of the Bears sticking and picking at 1. But then Fields has got to go somewhere, you'd think, as a QB1 in 2024. And it's not that the options are limited, but you start to look around and where could he end up? And if it's the Falcons, then you don't really have to worry about them. I wouldn't think taking McCarthy unless they 100%. Wanted to just double up.
Sure. Moving to a different position, I guess. I know this cornerback room is kind of full, at least in terms of bodies, but at least in my opinion, it feels like they need another guy there that especially can just handle the boundary, play some press man for this defense, because they utilized a lot of zone last year. Do you think that the Vikings should try to go get a veteran in free agency? Do they draft another cornerback, or do they just kind of run it back with the same sort of group that they had last year?
For me, this would be in strong consideration for that round 2 pick. And I know I said before with the potentially delineate a round 3 pick to a running back. I'm aware of Vikings fans that the Vikings don't currently have a round 3 pick. This would require some moving around the board, but I believe it's 42nd where they're in the second round, something like that. Yeah, there's going to be a good cornerback there. I mean, you look at the top big group. The thing that we argue about is you have 5 guys that you could potentially make an argument for CB1. The thing I wouldn't want to do on draft day probably is lead that dance. But, is there a shot that one of those guys falls into the top of the second? I think that there is a shot. And so that's where I would be starting to think for the Vikings. I'm talking about Quinyon Mitchell, Kool-Aid McKinstry, my boy Cooper DeJean, who I do think can play cornerback in the NFL. And it wasn't a fair catch, Gopher fans. Terrion Arnold and Nate Wiggins. You got 5 studs right there.
Yeah, I completely agree on DeJean. I think that he's going to be an absolute stud. I'm a little bit worried about him and man on the boundary just because of his size a little bit, but I think
that's fair. Also, because Iowa runs predominantly zone, we know it, and Iowa defenders over. Let me just go on a little rant here, or a little context adding thing. Over the years, you have seen the last decade, Iowa defensive backs a lot of times will get unnecessarily dinged a little bit because they play so zone heavy, and some of these playmakers they had. You would constantly hear the same things of is he as athletic, or is he, whatnot? And we had to see his testing numbers and whatnot, because you don't get to see him run the 40 yards as much. But DeJean's an absolute playmaker. Whether you want to put him at safety, whether you want to put him at boundary cornerback, whether you want to put him at nickel, there's all sorts of different thoughts about that. But I totally agree with that. What you're saying. It is at least a part of his eval that you didn't get to see quite as much as other people. The one slight pushback I put on it is just kid's a playmaker wherever you put him. And then also the NFL plays an extremely high preponderance percentage of zone now across the board.
Right. And Brian Flores, he's going to play anybody wherever they're best. So he can find a spot for him.
For sure. And a guy who loves to move people around and stuff like that. Dijon, I don't know if he gets talked like this or proper credit for it, but he is one of the defensive move pieces in this draft. Typically, we think about that. It's more like the Isaiah Simmons kid who busted or whatever, or like a guy like that. It's like a guy who's like a hybrid between a linebacker and edge or whatever. But Dijon is that, but in the defensive backfield.
Thor, another topic that I think is also important heading into the offseason is WR3, and that's really because we're not sure of Hawkinson's timetable for recovery. So in theory, you might have a WR3 that's getting about 7-8 more targets in September than he usually would. So I want to know, in that same vein as my running back question, your prediction and your endorsement, will the Vikings just kind of promote Jalen Nailor, re-sign Brandon Powell, bring KJ Osborne back, sign a different free agent, or use the draft to get a WR3?
I think later on, I think is where you start to look at receiver. And I do think that you bring up a great contextual point about this 12 personnel offense that it looks like right now is not going to be able to run 12 personnel in September. And then also, what's going on with the KJ Osborne. If KJ Osborne's out the door, you're going to need one as well. I wouldn't trust Nailor there. Nailor, for me, he's your prototypical like wide receiver 5 guy in the NFL, maybe wide receiver 4. In a scenario where you got to use that guy more, I think it becomes a little bit more important, but you might have to get by with Nailor at wide receiver 3 in September, because we're going through some of these different holes that the Vikings have. I'm not sure that you'll end up putting receiver above that, but I will say the receiver class is pretty dang deep. When we talk about the receiver class, it's like Marvin Harrison Jr. and Roman Dunze and Malik Neighbors, and those guys dominate the conversations, and they are what they have been forwarded as. Like, all 3 of those guys would have been wide receiver 1 in most classes, but I think what gets lost a little bit is the depth of this class. I just have, like, in my database, I just have a rough draft of receiver rankings. Like, I have rough draft for a lot of other, just to, it's not, I'm not close to finalized, but you just sort of start to get a sense for the depth of things. Like in my list, I have guys 24th, 25th receivers who I actually like their games a little bit. Like I have Brendan Rice at 24. I think he's going to be a decent. He's going to hang around for a long time. Jerry Rice's son, and he's in the big frame and everything. Did stuff at USC. Jacob Cowing, I have wide receiver 25. He's an athletic kid who did really well in college for 4+ years. 5 years, really. He destroyed the Conference USA at UTEP, and then went up to Arizona and 1,000+ yards, whatnot. But it just speaks to the depth. Taj Washington's down there. Malik Washington, the kid from Virginia, who the Shrine Game people who brought him down, they say he's bigger Zay Flowers, which is overstating it, but that kid's good too. And I'm just trying to make a point of how deep this thing is. Ricky Pearsall, Jamari Thrash, Tez Walker, Luke McCaffrey, Jermaine Burton, all those guys are outside most wide receiver 15s. So if you're a team like the Vikings, if we're sort of thinking, in general, like 5th round potentially to earmark for a wide receiver, I think the Vikings have 2 5s. If I'm remembering, I should have this right in front of me. But that I think, you don't go into a draft myopic if you're the decision maker. Like, this pick is for this pick is for that. That's how you end up with Christian Ponder in the first round, in the top half of the first round. But you go in with generalized ideas and buckets for this sort of thing. I think that the value will be there in the 5th round for a receiver that not only that will justify the value of it, but potentially could, to your point earlier, compete with a Jalen Nailor if that is for wide receiver 3 on opening day.
Okay, so you think that's what they'll do, and that's what you would do as well?
I think so, yeah. Okay. And it's just because, again, you have the first, you have the second. I'm not putting a wide receiver towards that in the Viking situation. Certainly, you don't have the 3. And then I want to, once we get into the start of day 3, that's where I would be thinking running back. And, you could start to think about the receiver in round 4 if one of the guys that you really like fell down. But otherwise, 4th, 5th round is where I would be sort of paying. Like, if a guy I'm a big fan of Javon Baker from UCF. If he's there in the 4th, now we're going to consider it. But like, if the couple guys that I'm like, if these guys are here in the 4th, if they're not there, that's when we go to the next bucket for the 5th, and then we try to hit it there.
Okay, wonderful,
cool. So spend a lot of time on receivers. I got one more question for you. Who do you think is a draft sleeper right now? Whether it's one of those wide receivers or a cornerback, somebody day 3 who's kind of projected to go a little bit lower, but who do you think is one of those guys that can step in and fill in a role immediately and be a contributor at the NFL level?
I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to bang the drum for Tory Taylor, the Iowa punter, who you can get at the very end of every PFF mock draft, which is ludicrous because Tory Taylor is going to come in and be a top 10 NFL punter from the day he gets in. We know from the data that guy goes in the 4th or 5th round, which by definition makes him a sleeper. I also think he's a fit for the Vikings. I'm sorry if Ryan Wright is watching right now. But I would consider that, as far as a guy like off the, super duper off the beaten track like that. But, we could go position by position at running back, like if the Vikings don't get the guy 3rd, 4th round, a guy that I would like for them, Isaiah Davis from South Dakota State, a guy that I think is falling beneath, through the cracks a little bit in this running back class. Ridiculous power. He runs a little bit upright and he's not as proven as a receiver just because of the constitution of that South Dakota State offense. But he's this upright power runner who sort of slaloms between the tackles. It's really hard to square him up. And you're not taking that kid down unless you get him flush. And sometimes it takes 2 guys. So the power element there, he has a little bit of a peanut butter and velvet to his game. He has the little bit of agility. You can't square him up, and then he brings the hammer behind it. So I don't think he gets enough credit for his game. For me, he's extremely close to Braylon Allen when you're looking at sort of in that phylum, except Braylon Allen's forwarded or has been as a potential day 2 guy, whereas Isaiah Davis never talked about that. To me, qualitatively, they are very similar.
The last thing, Thor, the Vikings offseason effectively starts with the Kirk Cousins decision. And on this show in January, every day I felt like I was flip-flopping in terms of a prediction. I couldn't get the drop on, God, they love him to death. All the players love him, all the coaches. And ultimately, though, when I've read the clues, I think they're going to move on from Cousins and probably make a splash and draft their guy. I want to know from you as we sit 3 weeks before free agency, what is your Cousins prediction?
I think you and I are probably going to be very, very similar in the way that we see this. I think this was tipped off before. Not only do I think it was tipped off that this is the prerogative of the guy making that decision, I think the guy making this decision arguably wanted to do this before this offseason. It seemed like those first couple he was in there, that maybe the Wilfs got in there and were like, hey, maybe we should run it forward for just one more year with Kirk. But then to your point about the breadcrumbs, what was it last off season that the Cousins camp wanted to talk the extension and Kwesi's like, no, I'm good. And it's like, we know you're good, because the off seasons before that, like I said, it seemed like they were setting this up for the Kirk divorce at that point. They ended up, grabbing the extra year on that. But Kwesi could have had this situation is only as it is because Kwesi decided as such. Kwesi could have signed him before. He could have signed him at any point. The fact Kirk is going to get to unrestricted free agency and be allowed to look around, I think Kwesi is going to put him to a decision. If you want to take a haircut on a 1-year deal, with the guarantees, we can tack on a year 2 just for, public appearances. But really, we're only willing to sign you really for 1 more year. And it's going to have to be at a beneath market value thing. I think that's what they're going to end up putting out there. And Kirk's going to be like, screw you guys. I'm going to take the multiple years with whether it's the Falcons or, what team we talked about before, or some of these other quarterback needy teams. That's what I anticipate. I think that they have tipped their hands on this. We know from reporting around town that they have been all over the quarterbacks. And I'm not talking Kwesi. I am talking that entire personnel department, all the scouts. And I'm not talking the last month. I'm talking since the beginning of the fall. They sent all their guys out into the field, come back with intel reports, and not on the 3 guys. I thought it was very interesting. The reporting starting in the fall that the Vikings like J.J. McCarthy and were doing deep work on J.J. McCarthy. I think I buy that smoke. I think there's fire behind there. I don't think, you're zeroing in on that, but that he was an option for them where they were picking whatever, in addition to those top 3 guys. I totally agree with you. I think we've seen the last of Kirk Cousins in purple.
I agree. I was having a off the cuff conversation with a guy named Cole Smith who writes for Purple PTSD I wasn't even picking his brain. We were just talking about this topic, and he said something last week that struck a chord with me, which is kind of obvious. Is to your point, Thor, they didn't extend him last offseason. Now he's a year older and he's got a bad Achilles. So why the hell would they do it now? And I stopped and I thought, and I was like, that's like the piece of evidence I need to be firm now that I think that they are going to, he's going to vamoose after 6 years.
1,000%. He would have done it beforehand if not, right? Like, how does that make the equation better, as far as how the Vikings are seeing the viability of bringing him forward? I totally agree with that. And you have the mountain of evidence that you can't be viable in the playoffs as a contender as the roster is constructed with Kirk Cousins, with the cap hit that you have to delineate to Kirk Cousins to keep him on that roster.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Josh, any final things for Thor before we let him go for the afternoon?
No, it's just appreciate talking to you, being able to pick your brain. I love your draft stuff, so I'll be making sure to tune into your content all the time. But yeah, this was awesome.
Thanks, brother. Yeah, it was good to be here.
Yeah.
You got your Twitter handle there. Where do you write, sir?
At Thor KU on Twitter, and my stuff is at Fantasy Pros and Betting Pros. We got a draft episode came out today. Me and Derek Brown, we started a new NFL draft show at Fantasy Pros. Today we dropped most polarizing players in the class. It's always kind of interesting, the dudes who just everyone argues about no matter what. Yeah. So we went through like the top guys at every position. Then we argued a little bit about those guys. Keon Coleman, I think, is, for me, he's like the top dude that everyone just, it's like the Anchorman fight, in the alley or whatever, every time Keon Coleman's name's brought out. So we definitely had to argue about him too.
All right, my man. Well, we appreciate you joining us. We shall see how these predictions pan out, and we'll talk to you next time. All right.
Appreciate it, boys. Thank you.
All right, take it easy.
See ya.